After a lifetime in the system, one young man received a key to a condemned church his grandmother left him. What he discovered behind the altar wasn't just about the past. It was a choice that would define his entire future. If you believe in second chances, and that home is something you build, not just inherit, then this story is for you. Stick around, and maybe subscribe if you feel like these are the kinds of stories that need to be told. The day I turned 18, the world didn't celebrate with me. There was no cake, no pile of presents, just a thin manila envelope on the corner of a metal desk. It contained a bus pass, a final check for $212, and my birth certificate, which felt more like an invoice than a proof of life. For 18 years, I had been a ward of the state, a case file number, a line item in a budget. Now, I was just Leo, and Leo was officially no one's problem anymore. My social worker, Ms. Albright, was there for the checkout. She had the perpetually tired eyes of someone who'd seen too many kids like me spit out by the system. She wasn't cold, just worn smooth, like a river stone. She'd been my case manager for the last 5 years, through 2 group homes and 3 foster placements that didn't stick. She'd seen me at my worst, sullen and silent, a ghost haunting the edges of other people's families. "So, this is it," she said, her voice neutral. She gestured to the envelope. "Your walking papers." A dry little joke. It wasn't funny, but I appreciated the effort. It was better than the forced cheerfulness some of them put on. "Looks like it," I said, my own voice raspy. I hadn't used it much all morning. My duffel bag was on the floor next to me, holding everything I owned. 3 changes of clothes, a worn paperback, and a faded photograph of a woman I barely remembered. My grandmother, Elena. The state had taken me when I was 4, after she died. They said she had no other family. They said there was nothing for me. I spent the next 14 years believing them. Ms. Albright sighed, a soft, weary sound. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out something else. Not a form, not a pamphlet, but a small, heavy object that she placed on the desk between us. It was an old iron key. It was huge, ornate, the kind of thing you see in fantasy movies, not in the sterile, fluorescent-lit office of a county services building. A frayed piece of twine was tied to its head, attached to a yellowed cardboard tag. "There's one more thing, Leo," she said, her professional calm wavering for just a second. "This came for you. It's been held in trust by the public administrator's office. It was part of your grandmother's estate." I stared at the key. Estate. That was a word for rich people. My grandmother had been a cleaner at a downtown office building. She smelled of lemon polish and peppermint tea. She lived in a tiny apartment that was always warm. Estates were not part of her world. "She didn't have anything," I said. It came out sounding more bitter than I intended. It was the official story, the one I'd been told 100 times, the one that explained why I was here and not somewhere else. "She had this," Ms. Albright insisted gently. She pushed the key across the desk. I picked it up. It was cold and solid in my palm, heavier than it looked. Real. The tag had an address scrawled on it in faded ink, and below that, a name. The Chapel of St. Jude. "A church?" I asked, confused. Ms. Albright nodded. "She didn't own it exactly. It was an old community mission that was abandoned. The city deeded it to her organization, which was basically just her, for $1 a year in the 90s to run as a shelter. After she passed, the title got tangled up in probate. Because you were a minor and her only heir, it went to the administrator. It's been sitting there ever since." For 14 years. A whole building, just sitting there, waiting. A sudden, sharp memory pierced the fog of my childhood. My grandmother, holding my hand, walking toward a tall, narrow building with a cross on top. The sound of a bell, the smell of rain on stone. "I remember," I whispered. "I think I remember this place." "Well," Ms. Albright said, and her voice was back to being professional, bracing me for the bad news she was paid to deliver. "Don't get your hopes up. It's in your name now, officially. But there are complications." Complications, the official language of disappointment. There are significant back taxes owed, and the building was condemned by the city 5 years ago. Structural instability, roof damage, you name it. A development company, Apex Holdings, has been trying to acquire the land for a new condo project. They've already paid most of the tax lien. They're just waiting for the foreclosure to finalize. She slid a sheaf of papers across the desk. Legal notices, demands for payment, a final offer from Apex. It was a thick stack. The weight of it all seemed to press the air out of the room. "They're offering $10,000 for you to sign over the deed, Leo, to walk away. Given the demolition costs and the tax debt, my office, the official advice is to take the deal. It's more than you have. It could be a start." A start. $10,000 to sign away the only thing my grandmother had ever left me. To erase the one piece of her that had survived. I looked down at the key in my hand. It felt like it was humming with a faint energy, a question. The $200 in the envelope on the desk was my reality. It would get me a room in a boarding house for a week, maybe 2. After that, I didn't know. $10,000 was a lifeline. It was a fortune. It was the smart choice. It was the sensible choice. But as I sat there, in that sterile room that marked the end of my childhood, I looked from the papers to the key. One was an ending. The other felt like a beginning, even if I had no idea where it led. "Where is it?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. Ms. Albright looked at me, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Surprise? Pity? Respect? "It's on the north side," she said, pulling a map from her briefcase and circling a spot near the old industrial riverfront. "No buses go all the way there anymore. You'll have to walk the last mile." She paused. "Leo, are you sure? There's nothing there for you." Nothing. That's what they'd been telling me my whole life. Maybe, just this once, they were wrong. "I have to see it," I said. I tucked the key into my pocket, its weight a strange, solid comfort against my leg. I stood up, slinging the duffel bag over my shoulder. For the first time all day, for the first time in years, I felt like I was walking toward something instead of just away. The bus groaned and hissed its way out of the city center, leaving the polished glass and steel towers behind. With every stop, the scenery outside my window grew grittier. The ads for luxury watches were replaced by peeling billboards for personal injury lawyers. Manicured parks gave way to vacant lots choked with weeds. I was heading into the forgotten part of the city, the part that gets sectioned off and ignored, left to quietly decay. It felt familiar. I clutched the strap of my duffel bag, the smooth, worn fabric, a small anchor in the lurching motion of the bus. Inside my pocket, the iron key was a dense, cold weight. I kept touching it through the denim, reassuring myself it was real. Ms. Albright's words echoed in my head. Condemned, back taxes, take the deal. Every rational part of my brain, the part that had been trained for survival in the system, screamed at me to go back, to find her, sign the papers, and take the $10,000. That money could buy me a small, clean apartment, new clothes, Time to find a decent job. It could buy me a foothold in the real world, a world that had never wanted me. It was the logical path, but logic had never felt like home. Home was a feeling, a scent, a memory so faint it was like smoke. It was my grandmother Elena's hand in mine, her voice a low, gentle hum. She was the only home I'd ever known, and the system had told me she'd left me with nothing. This key, this condemned church, it was a crack in that story. It was the first piece of evidence to the contrary. Maybe she hadn't left me nothing. Maybe she had left me something impossible. The bus driver yelled out the name of the last stop. "End of the line, kid. River Street." I was the only one left on board. I mumbled my thanks and stepped out into the damp, gray air. The river was invisible behind a line of derelict warehouses, their windows like vacant eyes. The air smelled of wet concrete and something vaguely metallic. A light drizzle began to fall, cold and persistent. Ms. Albright was right. There was nothing out here. The street was a patchwork of cracked asphalt and potholes. Most of the storefronts were boarded up, their signs faded into illegibility. A single flickering neon sign advertised a bar called the Rusty Anchor, but it looked as dead as everything else. I pulled the crumpled map from my pocket. The address wasn't far. I walked, my worn sneakers splashing in the shallow puddles. The drizzle soaked into the thin fabric of my jacket. I passed a corner store with a wire mesh over its windows. A man with a long gray beard sat on a milk crate out front, watching me with disinterested eyes. He didn't look dangerous, just weathered, part of the landscape. The further I walked, the more the city dissolved. The warehouses gave way to small, tired-looking houses, many with sagging porches and overgrown yards. This wasn't a place people moved to. It was a place people were left. And then I saw it. At the end of a short, dead-end street, it stood alone in a field of weeds. The Chapel of St. Jude. It was smaller than I'd imagined, a simple, narrow building of dark gray stone, with a steep pitched roof and a small, empty bell tower. A single large circular window was set above the main doors, its stained glass mostly gone, leaving jagged holes that stared out like a broken eye. The roof sagged in the middle. A large, angry-looking red sign was nailed to the heavy oak doors, the word "Condemned" printed in stark white letters. It was a ruin. It was a disaster. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, because it was mine. I stopped at the edge of the property, my feet sinking slightly into the soft, muddy ground. The weeds were knee-high. A rusted chain-link fence, collapsed in several places, marked the perimeter. It looked even worse up close. The stone was stained with years of grime and water, and ivy snaked its way up one side, prying into the mortar. This wasn't an inheritance. It was a burden, a tombstone. And yet, I couldn't turn away. I walked slowly up the cracked stone path that led to the entrance. The air grew still, the sounds of the distant city fading away. All I could hear was the soft patter of the rain and the frantic beating of my own heart. I reached the double doors. They were made of thick, dark wood, banded with iron. The condemnation notice was an ugly scar. I reached out and touched the wood. It was solid, real. This was the place from that wisp of a memory. I could feel it. I pulled the iron key from my pocket. My hand was trembling. The keyhole was a dark, intricate shape, filled with rust and cobwebs. For a moment, I was certain the key wouldn't fit, or the lock would be seized solid after so many years. This whole trip would be for nothing. It would be the universe's final, cruel joke. Here's a door you can never open. I took a breath. I slid the key into the lock. It scraped. It resisted. And then, with a final push, it sank in all the way. It fit. A jolt went through me, sharp and electric. It fit. I gripped the cold, ornate head of the key with both hands and turned. The sound it made was awful, a deep, groaning shriek of metal on metal that echoed in the silence. It felt like I was breaking a bone. The lock resisted, fighting me, holding on to its long-kept secret. I put my shoulder into it, gritting my teeth, pushing with all the fear and hope and anger that had been simmering inside me for years. And then, with a loud, final clunk, the mechanism turned. The door was unlocked. I pulled the key out and pushed. The heavy door swung inward on protesting hinges, opening a slice of darkness into the gray afternoon. The air that flowed out was thick and musty, the smell of trapped time. It smelled of damp stone, decaying paper, and something else, something faint and floral. Lavender. My grandmother's favorite soap. I stood on the threshold, rain dripping from my hair, peering into the gloom. I was terrified, but I stepped inside. The darkness inside the chapel was absolute for a moment, a stark contrast to the overcast day. As my eyes adjusted, shapes began to emerge from the gloom. Faint light filtered through the broken, stained glass window high above and through the grimy panes of the tall, narrow windows that lined the nave. Dust motes danced in the weak shafts of light like tiny, silent ghosts. The air was cold, colder than outside, and heavy with the scent of decay. But underneath the must and damp, that faint lavender scent lingered, a phantom presence. The sound of the heavy door closing behind me echoed through the space with a deafening boom, sealing me inside. I was alone, utterly alone. But I didn't feel lonely. I felt like I was in the presence of something. The main room was long and narrow. Rows of simple wooden pews, covered in a thick blanket of dust, faced a raised platform at the far end. Hymnals and prayer books lay scattered on the seats, some swollen and warped by moisture, their pages fused together. A fine layer of grit and plaster dust covered everything, crunching under my sneakers as I took a tentative step forward. My footsteps were the only sound. I walked slowly down the central aisle, my hand trailing over the top of a pew. The wood was rough, dry. I could feel the immense silence of the place. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a heavy, waiting silence, the kind that holds stories. I imagined my grandmother here. Was this where she'd brought the city's forgotten people? The homeless, the addicted, the ones who, like me, had slipped through the cracks. Did she stand at the front and speak words of comfort? Did she hand out blankets and hot soup? The place felt less like a church and more like a lifeboat, a sanctuary in the truest sense of the word. I reached the front. 3 wide steps led up to the raised chancel. In the center stood the altar, a simple, heavy block of stone, draped in a rotting, dust-colored cloth. Behind it, on the wall, was a plain wooden cross. To the left was a small, unadorned pulpit. To the right, a door that probably led to a back room or office. Everything was still, preserved in a layer of grime. It was a perfect, undisturbed ruin. I ran my hand over the altar's stone top. It was freezing cold. This was the heart of the place, the focal point, The prompt title from the video I felt I was living in swirled in my head. What was behind the altar left him speechless. It felt absurd, like a line from a movie trailer. But here I was. I stepped around the stone block, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. The space between the back of the altar and the wall was narrow, filled with shadows. There was nothing there at first glance, just more dust, a few dead leaves that had blown in through the broken window, and a discarded, empty candle box. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, pricked at me. Of course there was nothing. What did I expect? A treasure chest? A glowing sword? This was real life. And in real life, condemned buildings are just condemned buildings. They don't hold secrets. They just hold asbestos and rot. I was an idiot, a sentimental fool who'd walked a mile in the rain to stand in a pile of dust because of a faint memory and a rusty key. The $10,000 from Apex Holdings suddenly seemed like the wisest, most wonderful thing in the world. I should have taken the deal. I kicked at the floor in frustration, my sneaker connecting with the wooden floorboards behind the altar. Instead of a solid thud, the sound was hollow. A dull, empty thump. I froze. I kicked it again, softer this time. Thump, thump. It was different from the floor everywhere else. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the cold and the dirt. I swept the dust and leaves away with my hands. The floorboards here were newer, the wood a slightly different color, and one of them had a small, semicircular notch cut into its edge, just big enough for a finger. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. This was real. With trembling fingers, I hooked my nail into the notch and pulled. The board resisted, sealed shut by years of humidity and disuse. I pulled harder, my fingers raw, grunting with effort. It wouldn't budge. I looked around frantically. I needed a tool, a lever. My eyes landed on the pulpit. Leaning against its side was a long, thin metal rod, probably an old candle snuffer or window pole. I grabbed it. Using it as a pry bar, I wedged the tip into the seam next to the loose board and leaned back with all my weight. Wood splintered. The board groaned. And then, with a sharp crack, it popped loose. I tossed the rod aside and lifted the board out, revealing a dark, rectangular cavity in the floor beneath. And nestled inside that cavity was a gray metal box. It was an old military-style ammunition can, the kind with a heavy latch on the front. It was surprisingly heavy as I lifted it out. It was cold to the touch and flecked with rust, but it was sealed tight. I placed it on the floor in front of me and stared at it. My mind was a whirlwind of questions. What was inside? Money? Documents? Just more of my grandmother's things? Every possibility felt both thrilling and terrifying. This box held the answer to why. Why she'd left this place to me. Why it had been left to rot for 14 years. Why she was gone. I fumbled with the latch. It was stiff, but it wasn't locked. I lifted the hinged clamp, the metal making a sharp clicking sound that echoed in the chapel. I took a deep, shaky breath, held it, and lifted the lid. The first thing I saw was money, stacks of it, neat bundles of $100 bills, held together with old rubber bands that were starting to crack. It wasn't a king's ransom, but it was more money than I had ever seen in my life. My mind, trained in scarcity, couldn't even process it. It looked like movie money, fake. But beneath the cash, there was something else. A thick stack of envelopes tied together with a simple blue ribbon. They were addressed to me. To Leo, in my grandmother's familiar looping script. I gently lifted the stack of letters out, my hands shaking so much I was afraid I'd drop them. And beneath the letters, at the very bottom of the box, was a single, thick, legal-looking document. A property deed. My name was on it. And a worn, leather-bound journal. I sat back on my heels, the cold of the stone floor seeping through my jeans. The money, the letters, the deed. It was all here. It was all real. I picked up the top envelope. The paper was dry and brittle. I carefully opened it. A single sheet of paper was folded inside. I unfolded it and began to read. "My dearest Leo," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the world has finally let you find your way back here. I am so sorry I had to leave you." The words on the page blurred for a moment. I blinked, trying to focus. The chapel was silent around me, but my grandmother's voice was suddenly loud in my head, reading the words her hand had written so long ago. I could almost hear her, the gentle cadence of her speech, the faint accent that softened her vowels. I took a steadying breath and continued reading. "There is so much I need to explain, my sweet boy. Things I could never say, secrets I had to keep to protect you. This place, this chapel, it was more than just a building. It was our sanctuary. And I hope with all my heart that it can be yours too." I looked around the decaying room, at the dust and the broken windows. Sanctuary. It was hard to see it now. I picked up the next letter. They weren't dated, but they felt like a story, told in pieces. "I didn't start this place as a church, not really," she wrote. "It was just a place to be warm. I got the deed from the city when you were just a baby. They saw a derelict building. I saw a roof. I saw a place where people who had nothing could come and not be judged. We had coffee, soup, a place to sleep out of the cold. We were a small, ragged family of forgotten souls. St. Jude, you see, is the patron saint of lost causes. It felt right. A lost cause. The label fit me so perfectly it ached. I could picture it then, this cold, empty space filled with warmth and light, the murmur of voices, the smell of soup instead of dust. A place where someone like me could belong. The next letter was heavier, the tone shifting. But when you offer a hand to the desperate, sometimes you attract the wrong kind of attention. A man started coming around. His name was Marcus Thorne. He was charming, well-dressed. He said he admired what I was doing. He started making donations, big ones, cash. He said he wanted to help us expand, to fix the roof, to buy more beds. I was so grateful, so blinded by the good we could do, that I didn't ask where the money came from. Marcus Thorne. The name meant nothing to me, but it was written with a heavy, deliberate pressure, as if the pen had been digging into the paper. He started using the chapel for business meetings, he called them. He and his associates. They were quiet, they kept to themselves. But I started to see things. Fear in the eyes of the people who came to see him. Whispers of threats, of deals gone wrong. I realized too late that our sanctuary was being used as a front. Thorne wasn't a philanthropist. He was a predator, laundering dirty money through my donation box, using the chapel's goodwill as a shield for his criminal enterprise. I felt a knot of ice form in my stomach. My grandmother, my gentle, kind grandmother, tangled up with criminals. It didn't make sense. She was the one who taught me that honesty was the only thing you truly owned. I wanted to go to the police, the next letter continued. I wanted to throw him out, but he was clever. He made sure I was implicated. My name was on the bank accounts. I was the one who signed the receipts for his donations. And then He made his threat. It wasn't against me. It was against you, Leo. You were just a little boy, not even 4 years old. He told me that if I ever spoke a word to anyone, he would make sure you disappeared, that you would end up in a place where no one would ever find you. He smiled when he said it. I had to stop reading. I put the letter down, my hands shaking. I could feel the cold dread she must have felt, the sheer, paralyzing terror. He had threatened me. A man I'd never met had held my life in his hands, and my grandmother had stood between us. So I stayed silent. The final letter in the bundle read, I played my part. I let him use the chapel, and I prayed every night for a way out. The way out came, but not like I'd hoped. The police finally started closing in on Thorne's operation. He knew it was coming. He came to me one last time with a deal. He would disappear, leave the country, but someone had to take the fall. A smaller charge, something to satisfy the investigation and make it all go away. He offered me a choice. I could take the blame for financial mismanagement, a minor felony, and he and his associates would walk away clean. If I refused, he would release fabricated evidence implicating me in his entire operation, and he would still keep his promise about you. Either way, I was going to lose you. The system would take you. My vision swam. I could barely breathe. She had been given an impossible choice. So I chose the one that kept you safest. I took the deal. I confessed to a crime I didn't commit. They called it embezzlement. It sounded so sordid. They said I stole from the poor. The irony was a knife in my heart. The money they convicted me of stealing was Thorne's dirty money, which he took back anyway. The money in this box, Leo, this is the clean money. This is every dollar I ever saved, every legitimate donation from before Thorne arrived. I hid it for you. It was all I had left to give. I was crying now, silent tears tracking paths through the grime on my cheeks. I cried for the grandmother I barely knew, for the weight of the secret she had carried. I cried for the 14 years I had spent believing she had abandoned me, when in fact she had sacrificed everything for me. They sentenced me to 5 years, she wrote. I thought I would survive it. I thought I would get out and find you again. But the heartbreak, the shame, it was too much for my body to bear. I got sick in prison. I knew I wasn't going to make it. So I wrote these letters. I left the deed, the money, and this journal for you. The journal contains everything, the names, the dates, the real story. It's the truth, Leo. It's your inheritance. More than the money, more than this building, the truth. I looked at the worn leather journal at the bottom of the box. It wasn't just a book. It was a weapon. There's one last thing you need to know, the letter concluded. Marcus Thorne. He's a clever man. He didn't stay gone forever. I've heard whispers, even in here. He came back, changed his name, and went into legitimate business. He runs a development company now. It's called Apex Holdings. The world stopped. Apex Holdings. The company that wanted to buy this land. The company that had the $10,000 offer on the table. It wasn't just a random corporation. It was him. He was back to finish the job, to erase the very last piece of my grandmother's legacy, to pave over the evidence of his crimes and build condos on her grave. It wasn't just about a building anymore. It was about justice. It was about her name. I held her letters to my chest, the brittle paper a fragile link to a love so fierce it had defied prison walls and even death itself. The choice wasn't about $10,000 versus a condemned church. It was about running away with a pocketful of cash or staying and fighting for the truth with the only weapons she could leave me. The weight of that choice felt heavier than the iron key, heavier than the box of money, heavier than the entire broken-down building around me. For a long time, I just sat there on the cold floor, in the silence and the dust, with the metal box open in front of me. The neat stacks of cash seemed to mock me. It was a fortune, enough to disappear, enough to start over, somewhere new, where the name Leo meant nothing, where the ghosts of the past couldn't find me. It was an escape hatch from a life I never asked for. All I had to do was take it, walk out that door, and never look back. Let Marcus Thorne, or whatever he called himself now, have his victory. Let him bulldoze this place and bury the story forever. My grandmother had made her sacrifice to keep me safe. Wouldn't taking the money and ensuring my own safety be honoring that sacrifice? It was the logical thing to do, the smart thing. But my gaze kept drifting from the money to the leather journal. The truth. Her truth. The story of a good woman backed into an impossible corner, who chose to wear the stain of a crime she didn't commit so her grandson could live. If I took that money and ran, I would be burying her too. I'd be letting Thorne's lie be the final word. Her memory would be that of a common thief, not a quiet hero. The $10,000 offer from Apex wasn't a business transaction. It was an insult. It was Thorne trying to buy my silence, to purchase the final piece of the puzzle and complete his 18-year-old crime. He probably didn't even know who I was. To him, I was just some faceless heir, an obstacle to be removed with a small pile of cash. The thought made my blood run cold, then hot. Anger, clean and sharp, cut through the fog of my grief. He wasn't going to win, not this time. My whole life I had been powerless, a pawn moved around a board by forces I couldn't see or understand. The system, the caseworkers, the foster families. I did what I was told, kept my head down, tried to be as small and unobtrusive as possible so I wouldn't get hurt. But my grandmother hadn't been powerless. She had made a choice, a terrible, heartbreaking choice, but it was hers. And now she had given me one. This was the first real choice of my adult life. Not about what I was going to eat or where I was going to sleep for a week, but about who I was going to be. Was I going to be the scared kid who runs? Or was I going to be Elena's grandson? I reached into the box and pushed the stacks of money aside. I picked up the journal. The leather was soft and worn. I opened it. Inside, in the same looping script, were pages and pages of entries. Names, dates, details of conversations, descriptions of Thorne's associates, license plate numbers she'd secretly jotted down. It was a meticulous record of her own entrapment. She hadn't just been a victim, she had been a witness. She had been gathering evidence. This journal was the weapon she never got to use, and she had left it for me. It was at that moment that I felt a shift inside me. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my gut. But something else was growing alongside it. Resolve. A hard, clear sense of purpose that I had never felt before. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was mine. My inheritance wasn't the building or the money. It was this fight. The responsibility to see it through. The phone in my pocket vibrated, a shocking modern intrusion in the timeless quiet of the chapel. I fumbled for it, my hands still dusty. The screen lit up. Miss Albright. I almost didn't answer. I didn't want to hear her tell me to be sensible again. But I did. Leo, are you there? Are you okay? Her voice was tight with worry. I'm here, I said. My own voice sounded strange, stronger. I'm at the church. There was a pause. Leo, I just got off the phone with the lawyer for Apex Holdings. They know the foreclosure grace period ends in 48 hours. They're rescinding the $10,000 offer. They're making a final one, $15,000. But you have to sign by tomorrow morning. Otherwise, they'll just take it at the auction for the price of the tax lien. 15,000. They were getting nervous, or impatient. It was more money, a bigger temptation, a final test. Tell them no, I said. The words came out before I had even fully formed the thought. What? Tell them the property is not for sale. Leo, think about this, she said, her voice pleading. This is a life-changing amount of money for you. What are you going to do with a condemned building? You can't live there. You can't afford to fix it. I have the money for the back taxes, I said, looking at the cash in the box. I did a quick, rough count. It looked like maybe $50,000 or $60,000, more than enough. I'm going to pay them tomorrow. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing. I imagined her in her drab office, surrounded by files of kids with no hope, no options. And here I was, choosing the impossible one. Leo, she finally said, and her voice was different. The professional weariness was gone. It was just soft. What did you find in there? I looked around the dilapidated chapel, at the light streaming through the broken window, illuminating the dust. I looked at the letters and the journal in my lap. I found a reason, I said, a reason to stay. I ended the call. The silence rushed back in, but it was different now. It wasn't empty anymore. It felt full, full of purpose, full of my grandmother's unwavering love. I wasn't a lost cause. I was the keeper of a promise. I carefully placed the letters and the journal back in the metal box. I would take the cash to the bank tomorrow, get a cashier's check, and walk into the county tax office. It was the first step. I didn't know what the second step was, or the third. I had no idea how to fight a powerful development company, or how to bring a man like Thorne to justice. I was just an 18-year-old kid with a box of secrets and a broken-down church. But it was a start. It was my start. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. If you've ever been at a crossroads like this, where the easy path is right in front of you, but your heart is pulling you down a harder road, let me know in the comments. These are the moments that define us. I read every comment, and I know how much it means to feel like you're not alone in these struggles. Your story matters. Now, back to what happened next. The next morning, I woke up on a bed of dusty pews I'd pushed together, a threadbare altar cloth for a blanket. My neck was stiff, and I was cold, but I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time, I hadn't woken up in a room that belonged to someone else, under rules I hadn't made. The pale morning light, filtered through the grime of the chapel windows, was my own. I packed the cash, all $57,000 of it, into my duffel bag, zipping it up tight. The journal and letters I kept separate, wrapped in an old piece of velvet I found in a closet, tucked into the inside pocket of my jacket. They felt more valuable than the money. Carrying a bag with that much cash through the city was nerve-wracking. Every person who glanced at me on the bus felt like a threat. I clutched the bag to my chest like a lifeline. It was a strange feeling to have something so valuable to lose. I spent my whole life with nothing, and there was a certain freedom in that. Now I had something. I had everything. I walked into the county tax assessor's office like I was walking into enemy territory. The air was stale with the smell of old paper and bureaucracy. A woman with a severe haircut and glasses on a chain looked at me over the counter with bored indifference. I was just another problem in her day. "I'm here to pay the back taxes on a property," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I gave her the address of the chapel. She typed it into her computer, her expression unchanging. "The Chapel of St. Jude. That property is scheduled for foreclosure auction tomorrow." "I know. I'm here to clear the lien." She raised a skeptical eyebrow. "The total amount due, with penalties and fees, is $41,254.12. She said the number as if it were a wall, designed to make me turn back. I unzipped my duffel bag and started pulling out the bundles of cash. Her bored expression evaporated, replaced by wide-eyed shock. People stared. The office went quiet. It was probably the most dramatic thing that had happened there all year. An hour later, after they'd counted the money 3 times and verified every bill, I walked out with a receipt that said, "Paid in full." The piece of paper felt like a declaration of war. I had just fired the first shot. My next stop was a hardware store. I used some of the remaining cash to buy a heavy-duty padlock, a new deadbolt for the back door, thick sheets of plywood, and a box of screws. I bought a push broom, a shovel, and a dozen industrial-sized trash bags. Then I went to a small grocery and bought bread, peanut butter, a case of bottled water, and a new flashlight with a pack of batteries. It felt good to be buying things, practical things. Things for building, not for running. The walk back to the chapel was different. My duffel bag was lighter, filled with tools instead of money. I felt taller. The man with the gray beard was still sitting on his milk crate outside the corner store. As I passed, he nodded at me. "Saw you yesterday," he grunted. "Place has been empty a long time." "I'm the new owner," I said, surprised at how natural the words felt. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on the tools. "Grandson of Elena, ain't you? You got her eyes." I stopped, stunned. "You knew my grandmother?" "Knew her?" He let out a dry chuckle. "Elena saved my life, more than once. Gave me a place to sleep when the bottle had me. Gave me soup when my stomach was empty. She was a saint, that one. What they said about her, about the money, none of us who knew her believed it for a second." He shook his head. "Good to see you, son. Her work ain't done yet." He turned and went back to watching the street, as if he hadn't just completely upended my world for the second time in 2 days. "Her work ain't done yet." The words followed me the rest of the way to the chapel. When I got back, the first thing I did was sweep. It was a massive, daunting task. 14 years of dust and debris. I started at the front, by the doors, and worked my way back. With every push of the broom, I felt like I was clearing not just the floor, but my own head. I swept away the cobwebs of the past, the grime of the lies I'd been told. It was hard physical work. My arms ached, and sweat dripped down my face, leaving clean streaks in the dirt. But it felt good. It felt real. As I swept around the pews, I found things. A child's lost mitten, a single tarnished earring, a program for a Christmas service dated 20 years ago. Small echoes of the lives that had passed through this place. This wasn't just a building. It was a repository of stories, of struggles, of small kindnesses. By late afternoon, I had a massive pile of dirt and trash by the door. The floor was still stained and worn, but it was clear. You could see the wood grain again. The space already felt different, lighter, more breathable. Next, I started on the windows. The broken stained glass circle was too high to reach, but I could board up the shattered panes in the nave. I measured the plywood and cut it with a handsaw I'd bought, the sound echoing strangely in the big, empty room. As I was screwing the first board into place from the outside, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. A man in an expensive-looking suit got out. He was tall, impeccably dressed, with silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his cold blue eyes. He looked completely out of place in this decaying neighborhood. He walked toward me, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel. "Quite the project you've got here," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "You must be the heir. Leo, is it?" I didn't answer. I just kept turning the screw. The drills whine loud in the quiet afternoon. "My name is Harrison Croft," he said, extending a hand. "I'm a senior partner at Apex Holdings." I ignored his hand. I knew he wasn't Harrison Croft. He was Marcus Thorne. He looked older, more refined, but the predatory emptiness in his eyes was unmistakable. He was standing on the land he'd tried to steal, talking to the grandson of the woman he'd destroyed, and he had no idea. "I believe our legal team made you an offer," he continued, his smile tightening slightly as I refused to engage. "A very generous one, I think. $15,000 is a lot of money for a property that's a teardown." "It's not for sale," I said, not looking at him. I finished with the screw and moved to the next one. "Let's be practical, son," he said, his voice taking on a patronizing edge. "This place is a liability. The city will fine you into bankruptcy for the code violations alone. You can't win. I'm offering you an easy way out, a fresh start." Fresh start. The same words Ms. Albright had used. But coming from him, they sounded like a threat. I finally stopped and looked at him, really looked at him. I let him see the cold anger in my eyes. "I don't want an easy way out," I said, my voice low and steady. "I'm staying." His mask of civility slipped for a fraction of a second. A flicker of genuine annoyance crossed his face. He wasn't used to people saying no. "That would be a mistake," he said, the smoothness in his voice now laced with steel. "A very costly mistake." He turned without another word, got back in his car, and drove away. I watched until the car disappeared, my heart hammering against my ribs. The war had begun, and the enemy now had a face. I went back to my work, my hands moving with a new, fierce determination. I wasn't just fixing a window, I was fortifying a wall. I was defending my home. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Wake up with the sun, work until my muscles screamed. Eat, sleep, repeat. I was a man on a mission, fueled by coffee, peanut butter sandwiches, and a righteous anger that burned hotter than any furnace. I finished boarding up the broken windows, sealing the chapel from the elements and prying eyes. I filled dozens of trash bags with rotted hymnals, debris, and layers of forgotten filth. I scrubbed the stone altar until the grime of years came away, revealing a beautiful cream-colored marble I hadn't even known was there. The physical labor was grounding. It kept my mind from spinning out of control with fear of what Thorne might do next. Every swing of a hammer, every shovelful of trash, was an act of defiance. It was me, telling him, telling the world, that I was still here. I wasn't going anywhere. One afternoon, while clearing out the small office behind the chancel, I found more of my grandmother's history. Tucked away in a rusted filing cabinet was a box of old photographs. There she was, younger, her face full of light, standing with a group of volunteers. There were pictures of Christmas dinners in the nave, the pews filled with people laughing. Pictures of kids doing homework at the pews, my grandmother leaning over them, helping. This place had been alive. It had been a beacon. And in one photo, a picture of a summer picnic held in the small yard, I saw a familiar face in the background. The man from the corner store, the one who had known my grandmother. He looked younger, but the weariness in his eyes was already there. His name was Walt. I learned that a few days later when he showed up at the chapel door with 2 steaming cups of coffee and a bag of donuts. He didn't knock, just appeared in the open doorway like a ghost. "Figured you could use this," he said, handing me a cup. "You're working yourself to the bone." "Thanks," I said, genuinely grateful. The coffee was hot and strong. "Saw the suit that came by the other day," Walt said, looking around the partially cleaned nave. "That was him, wasn't it? The one who caused all the trouble?" I nodded, my hand tightening around the warm cup. "He calls himself Harrison Croft now." Walt spat on the ground just outside the door. "Can call himself the King of England. Don't make him any less of a snake. You be careful, kid. That man plays for keeps." "I know," I said. "He's not going to scare me away." Walt studied me for a long moment. "No," he said slowly. "I don't think he is. You really are Elena's grandson." He stayed for an hour, telling me stories about my grandmother. He told me how she'd faced down a landlord trying to illegally evict a family, how she'd spent a week tracking down a runaway teenager, how she'd used her own meager savings to buy medicine for a sick man who had no one. The stories painted a picture of a woman of immense strength and quiet courage. She wasn't just a victim of Marcus Thorne, she was his opposite. She built things, he destroyed them. She gave, he took. She was building a community, I said, the realization dawning on me. It wasn't just about charity. "Exactly," Walt said. "She knew that what people need more than a meal is a place to belong, a little dignity. That's what this chapel was." After he left, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just reclaiming a building, I was reclaiming an idea. The legal threats started a few days later. Official-looking letters began to arrive, delivered by courier. They were from Apex Holdings' legal team. Cease and desist orders, notices of code violations from the city, clearly instigated by Thorne. Threats of lawsuits. Each one was designed to intimidate, to overwhelm, to make me feel small and powerless, to make me believe I was in a fight I couldn't possibly win. I took every letter and filed it neatly in a folder. Then I called Ms. Albright. "Leo, I was hoping you'd call," she said. There was a new energy in her voice. "I've been doing some digging. After you told me what you found, I couldn't let it go. I pulled your grandmother's case file, the original one." "And?" I asked, my heart quickening. "And it's full of holes. The public defender assigned to her barely put up a fight. The evidence was thin, based almost entirely on her confession. It always felt wrong, but no one had a reason to look deeper. Until now." She paused. "I spoke to a friend of mine at the Legal Aid Society, a man named Ben Carter. He's one of their best investigators, a real bulldog. He specializes in wrongful conviction cases. He's agreed to look at your grandmother's journal, pro bono." Hope, fierce and bright, surged through me. I wasn't alone in this fight anymore. "When can he see it?" I asked. "He can meet you tomorrow." Ben Carter was the opposite of Marcus Thorne in every way. He was short, rumpled, with a coffee-stained tie and a relentless, intelligent gaze. He met me at a small diner not far from the chapel. I handed him the journal and the letters, and he read them right there at the table, his expression growing more and more grim. "This is dynamite," he said, finally looking up at me. "She kept meticulous records. If we can verify even half of this, we can not only clear her name, but we can open a criminal investigation into Thorne." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into mine. "But he's not going to go down easy. He's rich, powerful, and connected. He's going to fight back, and it's going to get ugly. Are you prepared for that?" I thought of my grandmother, writing these letters in a prison cell. I thought of Walt, his life saved by her kindness. I thought of the black car and the cold threat in Thorne's eyes. "I'm prepared," I said. "Good," Ben said with a thin smile, "because I think we can win." The next few weeks were a blur, while Ben and his team began the painstaking work of verifying the details in the journal, tracking down old bank records, looking for the people my grandmother had named. I continued my work on the chapel. The fight had two fronts, the legal one, waged in offices and courtrooms, and the physical one, waged with a hammer and a broom. Walt started coming by every day, sometimes with coffee, sometimes just to sit and watch. Then one day, he brought a friend, a retired carpenter named Sal. Sal looked at the sagging roof, shook his head, and came back the next day with a truck full of tools and lumber he'd acquired. "Can't let Elena's place fall down," he said gruffly, and got to work. A few days after that, a woman named Maria, who ran a small bakery nearby, showed up with a box of pastries. She told me my grandmother had helped her write the business plan for her bakery. Soon, others started appearing. A plumber who fixed the ancient leaking pipes for the cost of materials. An electrician who rewired the main panel, ensuring the building wouldn't be a fire trap. People my grandmother had helped, one by one, coming back to repay a debt of kindness that was almost 2 decades old. They didn't just bring their skills, they brought their stories. Each one was another brushstroke in the portrait of the woman I had barely known. I learned about her unwavering belief in second chances, her fierce sense of justice, her bottomless well of compassion. The chapel slowly began to transform. The roof was patched. The broken windows were replaced with new glass. The pews were sanded and refinished. The walls were scrubbed clean. Light and air began to fill the space again. It wasn't just me working anymore. It was a community. We were rebuilding not just a structure, but a legacy. One evening, as we were all packing up, Ben Carter called. "We got him," he said, his voice laced with triumph. "We found one of Thorne's old associates, the guy he used to handle his finances. He's old, sick, and terrified of going to jail. He's ready to corroborate your grandmother's entire journal in exchange for immunity. The DA's office is reopening the case. They're issuing a warrant for Marcus Thorne." I sank down onto a newly refinished pew, the phone pressed to my ear. It was over. The legal battle, at least. She was going to be free. Her name was going to be cleared. Tears welled in my eyes. They weren't tears of grief this time. They were tears of gratitude. For my grandmother's strength, for Ben's tenacity, for the quiet loyalty of Walt, Sal, and all the others. I looked around the chapel. It was no longer a ruin. It was filled with the sounds of quiet work and shared purpose. It was filled with light. It was coming back to life, just like me. The downfall of Marcus Thorne was swift and quiet. There were no dramatic courtroom showdowns. Faced with the corroborated evidence from my grandmother's journal and the testimony of his former associate, he folded. His lawyers negotiated a plea deal. He would plead guilty to a host of financial crimes and the charges related to my grandmother would be publicly acknowledged as part of a coerced confession. He would serve time. Apex Holdings collapsed under the weight of the scandal. The news made a small ripple in the city papers. A story about a corrupt developer, a cold case reopened. But for me, for Walt, for the small community gathering around the chapel, it was an earthquake. My grandmother's name was officially cleared. A judge posthumously vacated her conviction. Elena was no longer a criminal. She was a hero. Ben Carter brought me the official court documents. I held the paper in my hand, the raised seal of the court under my thumb. It felt heavier than the deed, heavier than the money. It was justice. A small, incomplete justice, because it couldn't bring her back. But it was something. It was the truth, finally brought into the light. With the legal threat gone, the condemnation order on the chapel was lifted. The city inspectors, now aware of the backstory, were almost helpful. They gave me a list of what needed to be done to bring the building fully up to code, but they gave me time. They saw what was happening here. They saw it wasn't just a building being fixed. It was a wrong being righted. The work on the chapel continued, but the feeling had changed. The desperate, defiant energy was replaced by a calmer, more hopeful one. We weren't fighting against something anymore. We were building towards something. The space was clean now, the roof was sound, the windows were whole. But it was still empty. "So what now, kid?" Walt asked me one afternoon. We were sitting on the front steps, watching the sun go down. "You fixed the place. You won the war. What are you going to do with it?" It was the question I had been avoiding. What was I going to do? Sell it? The property, now cleared of all liens and legally sound, was valuable. I could walk away with a lot of money. More than enough for a real fresh start. I could go to college, travel, be anyone I wanted to be. But when I looked back into the chapel, at the clean, empty space, I didn't see a real estate opportunity. I saw a promise. I saw my grandmother's legacy. I saw the faces of Walt, Sal, Maria, and all the others who had come to help. "I'm not selling," I said. "This place was a sanctuary. It needs to be one again." Walt smiled, a slow, deep smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I had a feeling you'd say that." And so, we began a new phase. We weren't just rebuilding a structure, we were rebuilding its purpose. We held a community meeting. I stood at the front, in the same spot my grandmother must have stood, and I told them my story. I told them her story. I told them about her vision for this place, not as a church for formal worship, but as a chapel for the city's lost causes. A place for help, for community, for dignity. Ideas started flowing. Sal, the carpenter, suggested a workshop in the back to teach young people trade skills. Maria wanted to set up a small kitchen to offer free meals, but also to teach cooking classes. Someone else suggested a space for tutoring kids, a quiet corner for a community library, a place for support group meetings. The energy in the room was electric. It was the sound of hope taking root. I used the last of the money from the box as seed money. We formed a non-profit organization, just like my grandmother had. We called it Elena's Place. The name felt right. It wasn't about sainthood or religion. It was about her, a woman who saw a need and filled it. The Chapel of St. Jude had found its purpose again. It wasn't my building anymore. It belonged to the community. I was just its caretaker, its steward. My role was to make sure the doors stayed open. I chose to live in the small apartment above the office, the same one my grandmother had once planned to fix up for herself. It was small and simple, but it was home. From my window, I could look down into the nave and see the life flowing back into it. I saw Sal teaching a teenager how to use a saw. I saw Maria handing a hot plate of food to a man who looked like he hadn't had a warm meal in days. I saw kids sitting in the pews, not for a sermon, but for help with their homework. I found my place. I wasn't a case file anymore. I wasn't a ward of the state. I was Leo, Elena's grandson, and I was home. My story isn't about finding a hidden treasure. It's not about the money or even the building. It's about discovering what inheritance truly means. My grandmother didn't leave me a property. She left me a purpose. She didn't leave me an inheritance of wealth. She left me an inheritance of character. She showed me that the worst things that happen to you don't have to define you. Your response to them does. You can be a victim of your circumstances, or you can be the architect of your own second chance. She taught me that home isn't a place you are given. It's a place you build, with your own two hands, alongside people you choose to call your family. The chapel still stands on that dead-end street, but the street isn't dead anymore. It's full of life. The weeds have been replaced by a community garden. The sound of a bell rings out from the small tower sometimes, not to call people to prayer, but to call them to dinner. It's a place of new beginnings, built on the foundation of a love that was strong enough to outlast a lie. It's a testament to the fact that no cause is ever truly lost. Sometimes I stand at the back of the nave and just watch. I see the faces of people finding a little bit of warmth, a little bit of peace, a little bit of hope. And I feel my grandmother's presence, not as a ghost, but as a living, breathing part of the community she created. Her work isn't done. It's just getting started, and I get to be a part of it. That's the greatest inheritance of all. This journey taught me that we are all caretakers of something, a memory, a promise, a dream. What has your life taught you about the meaning of home or the power of a second chance? I really want to know. Share your story in the comments below. Reading them reminds me that we are all part of a larger story, a community of people who have faced the darkness and chosen to build something in the light. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of these kinds of stories to connect us and give us hope, please consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you for listening. Be well, and don't ever be afraid to fight for the truth. It's the only thing that's truly ours.